This is the year of self-crafting, and we are getting to a topic this week when the American colonies were actually self-crafting a new nation. And the title of this week is Novus, Ordo, Seclorum, a new order of the ages. So to give us an opening presentation, Maurice Bisheff, a longtime member of the Institute of World Culture, and someone who has spoken to us in the past on the American Revolutionary War to a certain degree. And he's actually a huge fan of Thomas Paine, who was one of the founding fathers, although more unsung than some of the others. He has been, and perhaps still is, the head of a Tom Paine organization to keep Tom Paine's memory alive. So he's a wonderful speaker for us to talk to us about this new order of the ages. One day before the day when America celebrates Independence Day, and the Institute of World Culture, which I took a lot of my inspiration from when founding Still a Moving Center, celebrates as Interdependence Day. And that's the way I like to think of it, is that the 4th of July is Interdependence Day. So Maurice, let me hand it over to you for this topic of Novus, Ordo, Seclorum.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you everyone for coming. Let me wish you a happy 4th of July in advance. And I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes maybe, the new order of the ages, then and now. So half of this will be about the American Revolutionary tradition, and half of this will be speaking about what's going on now. But I promise at the end, I'll speak about something that we can create every day amongst each of us. So I know it's going to get big for a while, but it's going to come down to us real quick. So once again, thank you for being here. We've heard from James Tupfer, one of our other speakers, what is truly classical is contemporary. And indeed, this phrase, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is a Latin phrase, was first coined by Virgil in classical times, approximately 70 BC to 19 BC, that's before Christ. And it was in the Eclogue of Virgil, and I'm going to read you the English from the Latin, give you the context of this phrase. It's very interesting. Now is the final era of Sibyl's song. Sibyl is spelled S-I-B-Y-L. And I don't know who Sibyl was or is, so I kind of looked it up. And Sibyl really refers to a group of female prophets or hierophants in ancient Greece. And they basically bestowed some of the Greek mysteries or some of the knowledge that they would give certain people that could kind of handle it about life and about nature. So now is the final era of Sibyl's song. The great order of the ages is born afresh. Now justice returns. Honored rules return, or the return of Saturn's reign. Now a new lineage is sent down from high heaven. So I didn't know that. So this is a pretty heavy duty phrase where it comes from. But it's very interesting because the founding fathers and then those that created the Great Seal of the United States, which is on the back of your $1 bill, you will find the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum. So it's very contemporary if you have any money, because a But unfortunately, the motives with money kind of tarnish the high spiritual essence of what this may have been. But nonetheless, what is truly classical is contemporary. Now, if we do a thought experiment for a minute, and you viewed the world in the year 1700 or thereabouts, what you might find is there are tribes, feudal systems, castes, kings, and the one thing they had in common is a certain kind of mental conformity or threat of coercion that within the group or the clan, you can have discussions and all that, but you don't mess either with the king or with the identity of the clan. There is a certain kind of mental conformity. And this you could find with maybe a few exceptions here or there all around the world. So if you wanted to, in your thought experiment, how would you plant the seed to open things up so that people might have the right to think for themselves, coordinate with other people, and do their duties with other people, but do it with more self-initiative and, in fact, maybe self-definition, maybe individuate a bit. Where would this seed of freedom grow and take root? And what ideas would evoke the will to risk a change in these feudal structures all over the world, for the most part, in one form or another? Well, somehow there was a world, it was called the New World, is really an old world too, inhabited by its caretakers. But there was plenty of room for others and a bounty of nature. New order of the ages, Novus or Seclorum, which would include everyone. You could kind of plant this seed. And in this seed is where something new might take place. And so if you planted this seed, you might, much like Sybil maybe, inspire people to come, and ships navigated for trade to the new world. And people came to this new land. But it was really a sample of the world's proletariat. It's a common people. Adventurers, fortune seekers, indentured servants, slaves. Some came for religious freedom, although some of that religious freedom was for their own religious sect and nobody else. But nonetheless, they needed the freedom. But people came, they formed the 13 British colonies on the eastern seaboard. And many who came, they were not the creme de la creme. I don't know what that really means, actually. But a lot of people who made this tough journey were kind of crude and rude. Some of them were, in fact, even slave traders, dehumanizing their cargoes. But the old world which they came from was also brutal and harsh in many regards. You know, somebody accuse you of something in the morning in a court, and on a whim, and in the afternoon, you might be hanged in the old world. So it was nasty. So isn't it amazing that the world's proletariat, not the creme de la creme, the most cultured and this kind of thing, actually came? And this is where freedom started to grow, because the British rule was way far away. And pretty soon the colonists became self-governing. They had to set up ways of social coordination. They had to have political priorities to feed themselves, have security, set up a society, have justice. And so the colonies were somewhat different, but at the same time, they were all self-organizing, if you want to call it that. Of course, the king was there and also established privileges. But pretty soon, the colonists didn't like the arbitrary British rule. way across the ocean with, remember, no technology now. You know, how would they even know what's going on a continent halfway across the ocean? And at least one motto that the colonists used when they decided to start throwing off British rule was no taxation without representation. Everyone might remember the Boston Tea Party when they threw out the tea. I'm oversimplifying things a bit, but the king's rules were becoming arbitrary in the minds of at least half the colonists. Now, there were also a lot of loyalists, especially those with kingly privileges that were given land or given a title or given some loyalty to the king. So the question is, what would happen to break this loyalty system, this loyalty to the king? Well, there were some skirmishes, but in January of 1776 still, there was not a clear consensus of will within the colonies to break free. Remember, that would be treason punishable by death. And revolution meant death, starting a revolution meant death for not only you, but your family. Besides, most couldn't have it so bad, except for slaves and Native Americans that were excluded from this venture. And within this context, in January 1776, a 35-year-old Englishman came to the United States. He had had different kinds of jobs in England, but he was known for being a good debater in the pubs, and caught the eye of Benjamin Franklin, who gave him a recommendation to come to Philadelphia and work at a printing press. His name was Thomas Paine. He was so inspired by the inspiration of people having free thought and being free and not being under the yoke of an arbitrary king, an arbitrary monarch, if you will, that he wrote it first as an anonymous pamphlet, but it was first titled Plain Truth, but then they changed it to Common Sense. Paine didn't bear the sins of his age. He did not own slaves and actually edited a magazine in America at that time calling for the abolition of slavery. He also met with the Iroquois Indians, the Iroquois Confederation, to learn more about how to govern in this new world. And that, of course, emerged as a confederation of states, the Articles of Confederation, which is our first governing document that we always forget about because we go to the Constitution, which came later. In Common Sense, Paine wrote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Novus, Ordo, Seclorum, the new order of the ages." He was imbued, he was inspired, and he was able to take the power of his pen and the power of his thought and somehow inspire a whole group of people. Now, his contemporaries, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and others, also expressed the same idea. They felt they were doing something for posterity, something for humanity. And it was just happened to begin here in America first, because like we pointed out in our thought experiment, we had to find some place in the world to start this. 1 out of every 4 colonists read Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. Historians can't figure out how this happened so quickly, because remember, there was just horses and ships. There was no radio or internet or anything like that. And Paine gave all the proceeds of this best-selling pamphlet to the American Revolution that came later. By that summer, July 1976, about 7 months later, lo and behold, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and the will was aroused to go to war, risking life, family, and farm against the British. It's now become a newly discovered fact that the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence got a memo from a non-member whose initials were TP. And so now there is direct evidence that Thomas Paine, the Englishman, influenced his good friend, Thomas Jefferson. It was rumored, but there was never any evidence until very recently. Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, incidentally, strongly condemned slavery as part of British trafficking. But any reference to slavery didn't make it to the third draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was the one that everyone signed. Now, this Declaration of Independence, as President Joseph Biden said yesterday when he was extolling my favorite baseball team, the Los Angeles Dodgers, for winning the World Series, also said to the players and to the on CNN that the Declaration of Independence, with its emphasis on equality, was a revolution in ideas, and that this country was based on principles of ideas. And as Joseph Biden said yesterday to the players, a nation founded not on culture or national origins, but on universal ideas and their inherent unity. Unity is very important. Paine wrote, "It is not in numbers, but in unity that our greatest strength lies. Yet our present numbers are sufficient to repel the force of all the world." So the American Revolution then started as a revolution of ideas, of principles in the Declaration, and it changed people's consciousness and aspirations, not so much their pocketbooks. It turned subjects into citizens. Instead of being a British subject, loyal to the king, and you just have to do what the king says, you became a citizen slowly punctuated with violent repressions over 200 years. But the idea was there. It created a republic. What is a republic? A republic is something that does the public's business, not the king's business. Franklin commented, "Here is a republic, if you can keep it." Now, our quote from Abraham Lincoln during the week here in my almanac says, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth this continent, a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." So liberty is not license or licentiousness. Liberty is a sense of developing laws which allow people freedom, including not just your freedom, but other people's freedom, and a constitution which says that if you have disagreements about priorities or freedoms, there is a process you can use through peaceful means and peaceful procedure to resolve it, not having a coup or a violent revolution. Remember, when this happened, this was truly revolutionary because there wasn't really hardly any place in the world, with maybe a few exceptions, where this actually occurred at this time. So it was, kind of amazing in a way. Now, what happened then is that democracy proceeded very slowly in this republic. Even white male, not all white males could vote right away. But it did establish religious freedom, separation of church and state. So, and freedom of thought in the Bill of Rights, where at least initially for the privileged, they would be able to have this. Now, the interesting thing about the separation of church and state is that when I was in Ukraine, now the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is now fighting with the Russian Orthodox Church, but they still think that they're kind of the leaders with the government. And so if you're of a different religion, they will, in Ukraine, they will tolerate you, but you'll know that you're tolerated. That is, you're kind of like a second class, we'll tolerate you. And you get that impression off the bat. So we shouldn't dismiss the separation of religion and state, because it allows people freedom to worship, which is very, very important, because it really gives people a chance to start the process of self-definition. Even though for many people it took many years, and for some people even today, it's not perfect and it's not completely inclusive. But it did have a start, and a lot of people sacrificed their lives, whether it was in the Civil War or in the other wars, at least to try to sustain some of this freedom. With no arbitrary king, then we became a government of laws that are, and so again, it's not an arbitrary individual, an arbitrary court, but rather laws and procedures. And through elections, we would have the potential to self-correct, because the founding fathers knew that things are going to go wrong real quickly. Remember, it's not the creme of the creme we're talking about, right? But the self-governance of the people, the common people, in all these colonies, going out, establishing the frontier, it was not beautiful at times, but through enshrining the idea of fair elections, at least the democracy has a chance to self-correct. And also the opportunity through elections and through free speech and through free press to shine light on our corruption and sometimes on our deficiencies. So the United States then, this revolution, became a beacon light for the world, for the possibility of self-definition and the development of our human potential, without having to conform to a narrow tribal definition of conformity or loyalty to a king in the party line. Of course, later this was mixed with other desires like economic opportunity, and that got extended into colonization. So all things can go wrong, but we kept at it one way or another. Meanwhile, back to Thomas Paine, after America, he went to France and participated in the French Revolution. He didn't speak French. And he is an honorary French citizen with a statue in Paris. Thomas Paine does not have a statue in Washington, D.C., but such as it is. Guru Nanak's quote for the day, although it's lofty, is the aspiration of the American Revolution. Let brotherhood with every being on earth be the highest aspiration of your order. And you've all heard the sound, crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. And that was the amazing impulse and the struggle to try to maintain and live up in some way, some fidelity to these ideals, although it was very, very difficult. So what about now? What about Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages? Where are we now? Of course, we can distinguish between the American dream, which I've just pointed out, and the American system, which definitely needs changing, because quite frankly, it hasn't been changed in 200 years. But nonetheless, by 1976, on our 200th anniversary, there started to be a new reflection of an impulse that Renee kind of referred to. Now, in 1976, on our bicentennial, there was an East Coast academic, William Barber, and he established a Declaration of Interdependence. And on the West Coast of the mainland of the United States, in Santa Barbara, the Institute of World Culture, co-founded by Raghavan and Nandini Iyer, both articulated a new declaration of aims. And we don't have time to go over it, but you can go to worldculture.org in Santa Barbara, and there are 10 aims. And those 10 aims were gestated for 6 months before they were even written down. So there was a lot of gestation that went into that. But some of the essence of this new declaration of interdependence, the Dalai Lama's quote for the week suggests and points to the future. Real harmony comes with understanding of human nature and the human promise. And that's where Institute of World Culture, or even the gems of wisdom, are so important, because it provides us with an understanding of different cultures, of different ideas, and a tolerance and civility as we learn from each other. Understanding of human nature, that is many, many lifetimes. But it does tell us in this new era, this new order of the ages where the seeds have been planted, that we have to go inward. We have to look within. We have to change the ratio of the manifest, which is outside us, to the unmanifest, nothing that does have any form, like you have in meditation, for example. And that this is where the major impetus is coming. And in doing so, what does this allow us to do? It allows us to be lifelong learners. So we can voluntarily, we're not forced to come to gems of wisdom, although Renee is very persuasive. But the fact of the matter is that we can develop and participate, and with Zoom, that certainly accelerates it, right? Groups that think about and reflect on wholesome ideas and how it affects our own behavior. And the important thing about lifelong learning is not that you've taken just 10 computer new classes or something like that, but that you're being more aware about how to select which ideas are living and which ideas are dying, which ideas are limiting and almost take on a false character, which might protect our false identity, not our true self, but our false identity, because we need to be a member of the group that is, like a motorcycle gang kind of thing. I'm not against motorcycle gangs, by the way. They're pretty cool. But the notion that we need something a little bit broader than just motorcycle gangs, so to speak. Something that gives us the ability as students with each other to think about wonderful ideas that have been put forth, like Novus, Ordo, Seclorum, probably like Sybil, one of the female hierophants of the great ancient times, and to be able to think about those principles and how we could apply them to our daily life. And when we select which ideas, the selection, for the most part, nothing can be absolute, should be on the larger rather than the smaller. That means basically rather than mine and thine, that's a smaller idea, mine and thine, it could be we, the human global family. And I think we can all see, if we look out, that people are leaving their sectarian, narrow focus of identity. And through global suffering, through tremendous uprooting in global life of peoples and places, but yet at the same time, through Zoom and through the internet, we're all aware and have access to information, that we're becoming aware that we're breaking out of our sectarian shells of mind, which can be a shell, right? Empty shell. And we're appreciating the human family. 7 billion plus of the human family, which the Dalai Lama, for example, has talked about. and that we are all members of the human family, and we all are responsible to some degrees for our family, our human family, which means that we're impelled to, when it's our kind of in our orbit of our self-defined duty, to be able to help others. But the Dalai Lama says, maybe before you do that, you have to have emotional disarmament of the mind. Now, we know about nuclear disarmament, but what about emotional disarmament? That the Dalai Lama says, in order for this new order of the ages to start to evolve, one needs to be able to calm, purify the mind, have an equanimity of the mind, so you can select calmly and compassionately and see how you can help others. Because if your emotion can get you going, a lot of people put on rock music and hip hop in the morning because they got to get going, right? They got to get charged up. But emotion has to be transmuted into becoming calm and being able to understand others. So we have to choose ideas that are more global, beneficent, compassionate toward others. And this becomes the new order of the ages. Now, it's kind of a struggle because we do have polarization. Polarization happens because people always usually think of us and them. But now we put right and wrong on us and them. And that makes things pretty difficult. Just because you're right doesn't mean you're innocent. And just because you're wrong doesn't mean you're incorrigible. It is a difficult problem to begin with and to deal with. But there's another trend going on, visibly and invisibly around the globe, toward this new order of the ages. I call it a feeling of universal fellowship. Again, that's another way of saying that we're all a family, that we have this universal fellowship. And young people know it instantly. So an Iranian can easily talk to a Hawaiian, who can easily talk to anybody. It's just easy. And they're not hung up with categories, a priori head trips. They're just coming from the heart and from pragmatics, right? So this universal fellowship is very, very deep. And quite frankly, this heart quality of fellowship can inspire our minds if we could calm them and have some emotional disarmament. This becomes sanctified common sense. And now we're back to Thomas Paine. You don't need a college education. You don't need all this paraphernalia. It may be good, it may be not. But this is sanctified common sense. When I mentioned a couple of these ideas to a lady from Mexico who's very articulate in English, and she said, well, she didn't know who the Dalai Lama really was and all that, but all of a sudden she spoke for 2 minutes, 3 minutes at me on the human family. I don't know where this came from. So articulate, sanctified common sense. She didn't read any book or anything. And I'm sure young people already kind of know this. So I do think that we're now starting to develop the seeds of a new order of the ages. But in order to have a new order, you have to kind of get rid of the old order. And that becomes the problem. So we can start tomorrow if we get a good night's sleep. Because if we get a good night's sleep, we'll be refreshed. Mm-hmm. And then when one wakes up tomorrow refreshed, and you look around, show appreciation to what you've received, to who you meet, to the waitress who may serve you. And not just tip them or something, but actually have a conversation where you show appreciation. That's the new order of the ages. That's the way we build it. And that's our great possibility. So that's really what's happening here. we're moving into a new order, but we have to let go of the ideas limited of the old. It's not going to be easy, but we can always appreciate each other in a fresh way if we can calm our mind and have a good night's sleep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Very inspiring. I'm wondering what our response is to the people who don't know very much about American history and to whom our founding fathers seem to be so hypocritical. It was very helpful to know that the first draft of the Declaration of Independence did have, a castigation of slavery. That's very good news, and one can understand that compromises need to be made when one is dealing with colonial delegates from the South who are all making their living on their plantations with their slaves. So that's helpful. But what else is to be said to people who actually really don't understand American history?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think what has to be said is that social facts that have been repressed have to come out. And it's painful, it's difficult, but the very framework of the Declaration of Independence, and to some extent the Constitution, imperfect as it is, and imperfect as the founding fathers were, that's the framework which allows this to come out. Whereas in Russia, for example, under Stalin, and even today, maybe under Putin, and a little bit in China as well, with Tiananmen Square, it doesn't come out. The critiques, the criticisms, and some of the tremendous repressions, even genocides, much like we've had many ones in America, at least we still have this framework to allow this to come out. So I just say, as I think I've said once before in the gyms, that it's not an either or situation, that I think these social facts have to come out. But at the same time, people might appreciate the fact that this country was the beacon light, and people gave their lives, Pearl Harbor, people have given their lives for freedom, imperfect as it was. And we still have this framework if we can hang on to it. Like Franklin said, you have a republic if you could keep it. But if we appreciate just this notion that this country does still have a framework of freedom and a framework of laws, impersonal laws and not a king, that's what's allowing all of this to come out, then we're just going to have to work with it. And in the process, this country might change. I don't want to go too far into it, but every 50 years, this country changed. The Civil War was 60 years after it was founded. The Constitution was 10 or 12 years after or maybe 9 years after the Articles of Confederation. So we're constantly changing, and we may probably change again, but hopefully we can have good values, humanistic values, caring about other people, and not rejecting, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. David.
I thought it was interesting. I had never thought of this before, but you mentioned that it was the Articles of Confederation or in the Declaration that in the midst of this somewhat violent overthrow of the preceding government, we founded this notion that we would have a way for that not to occur going forward.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Well, the purpose of a constitution, really, and a lot of countries have better ones, quite frankly, and a lot of them have unwritten constitutions. I suspect a lot of groups have unwritten kind of ways But what a constitution does is allow you to become a container for desires and interests that people have, and a way to work with them and resolve them, because we kind of agree on the general rules of the game, the rules of the Constitution. The problem with America is that we lost the love of the people. And then once you lose your love, then you can't, what difference does the rules make? You still have to love the people. I mean, Ronald Reagan got together with the Speaker of the House in the 1980s, and they went to these bars and coffee houses in Washington, D.C., and they liked each other. And President Biden is trying to like a lot of people, trying to cross the aisle, you know. We need to learn to love each other. And if we don't love each other, we'll get her all these laws. But the purpose, David, of having these arrangements is for a peaceful resolution of conflict. And at the same time, developing a sense of unity where we do get to know each other through conflict sometimes. Doesn't have to be violent conflict, but differences of opinion. And we start maybe even to get to like each other. And so we form a unity around our purpose, a unity around these higher ideals. You know, one of the problems with marriage sometimes in modern marriage is that it's the husband and the wife. Two people are unstable. Two is an unstable number. They need a third point, like common ideals, values, maybe even common interests, if you like. That's what's going to hold those two together, because they're going to be rough patches. But nowadays, everyone's on their own kind of thing, and everyone's forgotten ideals and vows and doesn't mean anything much anymore. And people can't hold together. But that was the quote about unity from Thomas Paine, which Lincoln read Thomas Paine. Lincoln was self-taught. He didn't go to school much. But he read that common sense. He read that quote on unity, and that's why he was criticized for not freeing the slaves earlier, even though he wanted to, because unity was the primary value for Lincoln that held together during the Civil War. So, you know, the government failed, you know, it broke apart and had a civil war 60 years later. The Articles of Confederation might be interesting because we may be too centralized as a government now. There's too much, we're too diverse now. And so it used to be that we watched the Yankees play the Dodgers in the World Series, and we had 3 kinds of ice cream, chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. And we watched Ed Sullivan's show and the Beatles on Ed Sullivan and all. And everybody watched the same thing, right? But now everyone is so diverse. You need to restructure, as Gorbachev said, perestroika, we need to restructure to allow people's diversity to be heard and to allow people to participate in a more accessible level of scale. Because when the democracy was formed, Philadelphia had 20,000 people. That was the biggest city. Think about it. Of course, you could have democracy in a township of 5,000 people, right? And Philadelphia was the largest of 20,000. And so you could see where we have a democratic deficit, if you will, where we need to rescale things and get it down to the people and accommodate this diversity. And some kind of confederation of states, not as weak maybe as the Articles of Confederation. And we have that creativity to do it. And maybe we'll be evolving that way. I don't know.
That's really fascinating, Maurice, that idea of restructuring being necessary, because not only have we widely diversified as a population, but we've also widely expanded in our numbers. And you're saying that when you have one kind of clunky federal system that's trying to handle such a diversity of peoples, maybe it would be a little bit like when the British Empire, you know, it was said that the sun never went down on the British Empire because it was around the globe. So it was handling such a diversity of peoples, and probably a great number of peoples as well, that it was no longer a viable means of governance. And so you're suggesting that possibly the restructuring would bring a kind of governance closer to the individual populations that are being served.
Yes, I really think so. And, you know, it's kind of common sense. I mean, we have the same government we did in 1778 or 1789 when we approved the Constitution. It's the same government, you know, the same thing. But I think things have changed a bit in that way. Also, I think there's a principle that if government has to, you have to strike a bargain. And so basically you aggregate the different interests. It's an aggregation of numbers, let's say, of votes of interest. And you strike a bargain. And the bargain is supposed to be good for the average. But who's average? It's like 31 flavors, right? Not just chocolate, vanilla, and ice cream. There's no such, so this notion that we're average, that we're all going to watch Ed Sullivan at 8 o'clock on Sunday and watch the Beatles, you know, that's kind of over, as you know. And so we do have to have some laws and some regulations, and they're not going to fit. One size doesn't fit all. But when you average out everything, you completely demolish diversity because you don't acknowledge the particular diversity. This also happens in companies, by the way, as well, but that's another subject. You know, large corporations, for example, is the same thing where, you know, one manager sets a policy, it just doesn't work for all the particular subsidiaries all across the nation. So no one likes it. So the more the national government does to set policies for the average, the more most people don't like it because it doesn't apply to them. You know, so when the Department of Motor Vehicles in California passed a law that said, once you get a trailer, you have to pay $400 and stuff like that, it was fine, except that the trailer I bought was going to Hawaii. And in fact, the Department of Motor Vehicles was shocked because I went down there and actually canceled our check. And it just freaked the Department of Motor Vehicles out. Kevin?
Thank you so much. You know, it's funny that you said that because about the diversity, I similarly had a situation with actually a medical situation. So because I'm here visiting in Hawaii, you know, I had an appointment with the doctor and she phoned in medicine from a different state. And we had the similar issue about this medication was restricted or something like that. And I just find that it's funny because I agree that diversity is so important to make this United States cohesive, but at the same time, it also limits us, just as you were mentioning about your trailer situation. So it would be interesting to try to get into the brains of the founding fathers and see, you know, what they would think nowadays if we were in this situation, just with so many different diverse laws and regulations within our own country. I think over to places such as the European Union or, you know, other groups that are banded together, and the healthcare system from one European nation to another is, you know, recognized. So it's just very interesting to see that as the development of these nations continue, we still all have a same common, you know, conflict, I guess.
Yeah, just a couple of comments, and then Kirk has his hand up too. It's very interesting that, a couple of professors got very angry at me from Europe when I told them they had too many regulations for the European Union. They thought I was just an anarchist American, which I am actually. But but if you look at the response to COVID, the Europeans have a much better organized, and everyone's a member of the National Health Service, right? So you would think that they would get the vaccines out quicker and all that. But in fact, just the opposite. Where in America, even with the previous administration poo-pooing everything and confusing everybody and not doing anything, even with that, now that Biden is in, we've been much more successful at getting the vaccine out to people than the people that are supposed to be better organized with regulations and all that, which are the Europeans. So the other problem with our government is we have too much power in the executive branch in the Constitution, which we've now discovered. And but the Center for Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara in 1963 wrote a whole big volume on this problem. So, but we just kind of forgot about it because it was it wasn't abused, and everyone just, there's a lot of inertia, because change is difficult because it's not that you're going to change or someone else is going to change. It's all an interlocking chain of interdependence. And that interlocking chain of interdependent interests can't change because everyone's interests get affected. And so that's what makes things difficult. That's why maybe we need a more peripheral strategy. In my letter to Joe Biden, by the way, I said that you should do regional savings bonds. Remember US savings bonds from World War II? That's how you fund your infrastructure program, with a coalition of the willing that'll be different in different regions. And that way you don't have to hassle what you're hearing about now. Kirk, you had a comment if you didn't forget it.
Well, our time is almost up, so this is really a wide-ranging discussion, Maurice. I really appreciate you bringing these topics up on the eve of the 4th. But I was wondering along the two trains of thought. One is that this very deep, you could say, impulse, which Thomas Paine represented, a new order of the ages, and undoing so much of the, you could say, rigidity and anarchy, or the rule by king, rule by wealth, subordination of many parts of society to that rule. But it seems like the discussion that you brought to our attention, it indicates that even with the structural differences that the Constitution brought in the organization of government, that there's inherent problems, because human nature being what it is, that there's a desire for dominance, a desire for wealth, desire for power. There's still, ingrained racism between peoples, and so the new order of the ages, it seems like, along with this redefinition, you could say, which actually goes back to ancient Greece, right? Because they had a sort of a fledgling democratic system there, but that it also involves, and I think this is what you pointed out for us, really, it also involves a change in human awareness and human consciousness. And that unless that fundamentally takes hold, that you can tinker with the system, and you can restructure, you can have smaller, governmental systems, but until human nature starts to awaken to our common humanity, like you're saying, and becoming willing to listen to the other, not demonizing the other, becoming open to ideas, and sort of awakening to our, you could say, I want to say, spiritual heritage, and common heritage, that without that, the new order is it's not going to happen, it seems like.
Well, I agree with you that the real revolution is not simply in economics or structuring. That's sort of the outward forms and possibilities. But in fact, it is going to have to be a revolution in human awareness and self-awareness. That is the real impetus for the new order of the ages. But it's not going to come about real quickly. But let's not forget the new generation. You know, the new generation, while it has some, you know, nothing's perfect, but they're not as hung up, and they've been born into this global world with all its suffering and their suffering as well. And so we don't know what souls are going to be born in the next 20 to 25 years. There may be less souls worldwide than before, given population rates, but so it's kind of going to be open-ended, but they may be more attuned to what you're speaking about, so I'm in total agreement with you. But this is going to take a long time. It isn't going to be, you know, right away, but we're living a long time in a way. You know, ideas live a long time, don't they? And so the quote for July 8th by Raghavan Iyer, the Institute of World Culture, is, "The inward stirrings of higher life within human consciousness presage a golden future for the race as a whole." So there's it just feels to me like there's something brewing. And it is around self-awareness, and part of the self-awareness is service to others, putting others first, and doing a little emotional disarmament with ourselves.
Thank you so much, Maurice. I think you've really brought us a wealth of ideas, and certainly brought us not only history, but your reflections upon it in a way that opened up for us, I think, a whole lot of questions. I think there's a certain tendency to think this is the way it is for us too. I mean, we've lived with this government now for over 200 years, and it seems to be the only way things could be. But maybe not.
Maybe not.
And to give ourselves at least the mental freedom to imagine, how could things be if we were able to open our awareness more to include others? How could things be restructured? How could there be from here forward a new order of the ages?
Yes, and I think we have to congratulate Mikhail Gorbachev, who talked about glasnost, which is openness, and perestroika, which is reorganizing. And he said that, I don't know where this is going to go. That's what he said, but we have to learn. We can, you know, let's get going. You know, we have to learn how to do this thing, and it's going to evolve. But as was mentioned, it's going to take a shift more inward to calmer minds and more generous spirit.
And also a shift outward in terms of inclusivity.
Yes.
That we need to expand beyond our own little view of who we are as a people, or just everybody needs to be included now. It's time.
Yeah.
That's
and
really
maybe we will have a separate session. I don't know if it'll come up in the almanac, but and some of you are acquainted, on drawing the larger circle. That means getting out of our comfort zone a bit and becoming more inclusive and drawing the larger circle. And the question is, how much diversity can we tolerate?
Thank you so much. Really, great thanks to you, Maurice, and to everyone else who participated. I'm not holding my almanac at the moment. I know our topic for next week is something like,
Spiritual progress, allowing seeds to sprout.
thank you. So we'll look forward to that and to seeing all of you. And thank you all. I think you were in attendance last week when we had that remarkable conversation with the gentleman who had survived his experience in the Chinese prison. And I can imagine that we're all kind of thinking about that in the backs of our minds, knowing this isn't just for this country, that things need to change. Things need to be, we need the consciousness to change everywhere. And perhaps this way that we are all able to sense our common humanity by being able to see each other, on the internet, to hear things, to travel. Maybe that's one of those other reasons for hope. Yeah. So thank you all once again, and happy Interdependence Day as well as Independence Day tomorrow. Aloha.
Thank you all for coming. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Maurice. Wonderful.
Mahalo. Aloha.